I shared with you when I gave the readings this morning that this is a new series, and it's a series that I'm calling Awakening Wisdom. Awakening Wisdom. Every once in a while, I like to go back to the basics and go back to some of our roots. I think there's great value in that. I know in many practices and many arts and many sports, going back to the basics, even when you're really advanced in whatever field you're talking about, going back to the basics is important. It helps us to have a strong, strong foundation. So whether it is a musician going back to scales or a gymnast going back to basic tumbling, whatever it may be, those basics provide us a solid foundation. And from that solid foundation, we're better equipped to deal with whatever else might be going on in our lives. I titled this talk, God is Not a Vending Machine. And yeah, and as I was going back over my notes, I said, well, yeah, it kind of fits, but Wendy, it's a clever title. Maybe it's not the best title, but it does speak to a concept of God that I think many of us may have grown up with, particularly when we think about prayer. We pray, many people pray to a distant anthropomorphic kind of God figure in the sky or somewhere, hoping that excuse me, that God figure will give us what we want, kind of like a vending machine. But in metaphysics, in unity and new thought, we don't see God in an anthropomorphic way. We don't see God as a physical being residing in time and space, but rather as an energy, as a force, and a benevolent energy, a benevolent force in which we live and move and have our being, and in which it lives and moves and has being. Today and for this month, we're going to be exploring some of the stars of the New Thought movement, but from ages ago. And today, we're going to be looking at Thomas Troward. In the weeks to come, we'll take a look at Florence Scovel-Shinn, Emmett Fox, and Emily Cady. Raise your hand if you are familiar with all of those. I know the Alberts are. I know just a few of you are, right? These are folks in our lineage who, in their day and age, were every bit as popular, perhaps even more so, than, say, the Wayne Dyers were when Wayne was around, or Deepak Chopra today, or Eckhart Tolle today. They were the stars. And what they said and what they taught, we hear echoes of in the people who are teaching today that we consider to be popular and the ones that we relate to. Thomas Troward was an Englishman. He was born in India. He was born in 1847 and passed in 1916. The philosopher William James, who is considered to be a great American philosopher and thinker, said this about Troward and his teachings. He said, particularly his teachings in one of Troward's books called the Edinburgh Lectures. Far and away the ablest statement of philosophy I have ever met, beautiful in its sustained clearness of thought and style, a really classic statement. Those of you who may be familiar with science of mind, I consider unity and science of mind to be cousins. I really think that our lineage, our roots, our basic concepts and teachings are far more alike than they are different. I'm not sure that they're different at all. Maybe the style of a community might be different, or the style of a ministry might be different, or how often the Bible is used might be different. But the actual principles and practices, I think, are pretty darn close. Troward really influenced Ernest Holmes, who was the founder of Science of Mind, and really influenced the primary textbook of Science of Mind. He wrote the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, a book called The Hidden Power, The Law of the Word, Bible, Meaning and Ministry, comments on the Psalms, just to give you kind of a bit of a feel. Imagine if he and the others we're going to study had social media, had email, had websites, had the opportunity to really distribute their message in a much faster and broader way. I think we'd find that many people today would know far more about them, right? His writing, some say, is a little difficult to understand. Reminds me a little bit of Ralph Waldo Emerson. How many of you are familiar with Ralph Waldo Emerson's? I don't think that transcendentalist knew how to use a comma, knew how to do anything but write sentences that filled a very long, complex paragraph. Nod your head if you know what I'm talking about. You really have to digest Ralph Waldo Emerson. And in some ways, Troward is a little bit like that. A brilliant thinker, a great writer. I encourage you, if you want to explore him more fully and really grasp what it is that he speaks about in terms of the power of the mind, the Edinburgh Lectures would be the book for you to take a look at. He really had, in my opinion, two overarching premises. And so I want to share what those are, and then I want to share some of his statements that I think fall under these overarching premises. And it's important because it gives a framework, I think, of his thinking and where we come from with our thinking and our practices. So basically, Troward believed that we live in that there is a reciprocal action of the universe. A reciprocal action of the universe. A simple way of saying it would be the idea of sowing and reaping. A simple reciprocal action of the universe was one of his primary premises. And the second is the idea that mental action influences material conditions. Mental actions influence material conditions. Does that not sound super familiar? Where do we think we got some of this? And it predates Troward too, but we're going to just start with some of these in somewhat more recent history. Mental action influences material conditions. What I like about this and the focus of it is the word influence. Influences material conditions. I think we can tend to be a little too simplistic sometimes in the way that we look at or talk about the power of the mind in metaphysical circles. I can remember being in ministerial school, and the very last thing you would ever want to have happen in ministerial school was to catch a cold. You want to know why? Because you would be asked, what were you thinking that caused that cold? Right? We can do quite a number on one another with some of our teachings. I call that spiritual malpractice, actually. Spiritual malpractice. And that's not to say that our mental actions do not influence health. They do. Our mental actions do influence health. Our mental actions do influence our relationships, do influence our prosperity. Our mental actions influence material conditions. But I think it is incorrect and very naive to think it is absolutely a simplistic cause and effect. Can I have an amen to that? In part, it's why I personally was a little bit irritated when the movie and the book, The Secret, came out. I liked, how many of you are familiar with the movie or the book, The Secret, right? It was really popular in its day, and it was basically talking about Metaphysics 101, the power of the mind, the power of consciousness to shape and to form, or at least influence our reality. But it kind of presented it in a very simplistic way and almost as if it was this really new idea, when in fact it's not a new idea. It's a very old concept, a very old principle, very old teaching. So where do we begin when we look at these two premises? We look at this idea that the universe is reciprocal in nature and that mental action influences material conditions. Troward would suggest that we have to begin with how we view what we might call God, how we view what some of us might call God. This is what he wrote. It becomes, therefore, the most important of all considerations with what character we invest the universal mind. Universal mind is another word or name that's used in New Thought for God, for spirit. It becomes, therefore, the most important of all considerations with what character we invest the universal mind. For since our relation to it is purely subjective, It will infallibly bear to us exactly the character which we impress upon it. In other words, it will be to us exactly what we believe it to be. Another way of saying what Troward is saying here is the concept that we hold of this divine presence or God, or his words, universal mind. The way that we hold that is going to shape the way we move and think and act in our lives. I believe it was Einstein, at least it was attributed, I believe, to Einstein, that one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves is when we think of this, I'm paraphrasing obviously, when we think of this concept of God or the universal mind, what attribute do we give it? Do we look at it as malevolent, bad, negative, scary, punitive, or do we look at it as benevolent, gracious, positive, loving, beneficial? I think there's actually 4 ways that we could look at this universal mind, the universe itself, God, spirit. I think the possibilities are these, that it is random. Maybe everything just happens in a totally random way. We could look at it as malevolent. We could look at it as benevolent, or we could look at it as neutral. And if you just stop for a moment, regardless of whether we could prove which of these might be correct, if you just stop for a moment and ask yourself, if I held any one of those 4 beliefs about this energy, this God presence, is there a difference? And the answer would be, hell yes. If we believe that this universe, this presence, this whatever is malevolent, we're going to have a very different way of interacting with each other and with the world and with the events in the world than if we were at the other end of the spectrum, where we believe that it was a benevolent universe. One of the things that I've come to make some peace with in my own mind and my own thinking is around things that I can't prove. And it's usually those really big questions, like a question like this: can I absolutely positively prove it? Can anybody? I'm not sure that they can. But what I can prove is what I actually experience in my life based on what belief I'm holding. Does that make sense? And so then I go to, well, then I might as well believe in the most positive than the least positive. Does that not make sense? That should get an amen as well, right? And believe in the benevolent. It doesn't mean that we're airy-fairy, goody, two-shoes Pollyanna. No, it does not mean that. We still have to look at the stuff in our life that's not working. And we have to deal with the stuff in our life that's not working. But if we have this fundamental belief, or choose to hold the fundamental belief, that this universe is benevolent, then we're going to be filled with a much greater degree of hope and optimism and positive energy. And when does that hurt anyone? It really doesn't ever hurt anyone. Reverend Ellen Davenport, Unity minister, wrote a book called 5 Unity Principles. And when you're in the sanctuary before the service starts, we have those principles circulating just to keep the solid, gentle reminder to us of what our 5 basic principles are in unity. But in her book, 5 Unity Principles, she presents a really great invitation and a challenge. She says, there are so many people who need to rethink their concept of God, because that's kind of what we're talking about here, to rethink our concept of God. So many people, I think, have left church for lots of good reasons, actually, but in their leaving church, they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. They've thrown out the idea of God or whatever we want to give to that, and have abandoned that. And I think that leaves a huge hole in someone's psyche and mind and soul. Ellen suggests that we need a God for grown-ups. That's not a white-haired guy sitting up in the sky somewhere. That's not an entity that is separate from us that we pray to like a vending machine, hoping if we just say the right affirmation in the right way and get on our knees in the right time and frequently enough, that this distant present is somehow going to give us what we've asked for. What we've asked for. I'm in communication with one of our members around the idea of offering and creating a one-off event, a one-off gathering this fall, where we would bring together folks that have been traumatized by religion, by perhaps the concept of God that they were forced to believe in whatever church they might have been attending, or to deal with what they might have experienced in terms of shunning or shaming if they left a very fundamentalist or very religious, very rigid religion, because the God piece or the spiritual piece is an important part of our lives. It is a really, really important part of our lives. For those who are maybe listening online because the idea of stepping into any sort of church or physical religious place brings up woundedness or trauma, I can understand that, but that's a shame, because we need this spiritual thing, this spiritual energy. Does it make sense what I'm saying to you? It's not religion, but we are physical beings. Yes, we have a body. You notice you have a body, and when you get older, you notice it even more. And some of the things you notice, you wish you didn't notice, and it doesn't always work the way it used to work. No denying we have this. We have a mind, right? You're using it right now to maybe agree with me, disagree with me, or make your shopping list for later. You have a mind. I have one too, right? We're physical beings. We're mental beings. We have feelings. We cry. We laugh. We feel shame. We feel guilt. We feel anger. We are emotional beings. We are also spiritual beings. I think we are that first and foremost. The Spirit comes in, and we come out in this form. Anyway, that's a whole other lesson, maybe a book. Troward gives us some pointers as to how this works. So his premise of the universe is reciprocal, and his premise or his starting point that how we look at the universe is really important, and some of us may need to do some healing work around that. My suggestion is it does not hurt you at all and can benefit you greatly to hold a concept of a benevolent energy, a benevolent presence. He goes on in describing how this energy works. He says, it is a universal rule that nature obeys us exactly in proportion as we first obey nature. Spirit is life, pure and simple. External things are the result of interior forces. It's an enduring truth which can never be altered, that, any infraction of the law of nature must carry its punitive consequences with it. We can never get beyond that range of cause and effect. When I was going over my notes, this is when the thought came to me. Sooner or later, our thinking catches up with us. Sooner or later, it may not be immediate. We may have all sorts of thoughts that cross our mind that don't manifest immediately, but the predominance of our thinking, the predominance of our mental, emotional attitude eventually catches up with us. Eventually catches up with us. And this is why being a safeguard to the best that we can, or a gatekeeper to the best that we can, of what we allow to take root in our thinking is so incredibly important. This is why practices like meditation are important, to begin to quiet the mind, to train ourselves to realize that we can choose our thinking. We can change our thinking. But to choose something different or to change it, we first have to notice what? Where we are with it to begin with. Where we are with it to begin with. Troward said the universe is a reciprocal universe. What I am holding in here predominantly is going to take form in my life. Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, talked about this idea as well in many different ways. One of the ways he talked about it was the body is the slowed down version of thought. The body is the slowed down version of thought. I'm listening to a book right now that one of you recommended to me, and I don't remember the title of it, but part of the gist of this book is a study of trauma, physical and sexual trauma, and part of what this book is writing about is the research that is being done that connects trauma, the experience of trauma, and how it physically resides in the body, and that the body is actually as if it's concretizing the thought or the emotion or the experience, and that it can be reversed, but there's a process that needs to happen for that reversal to take place. I'm aware of the time, and there's so much I want to share with you, so I'm going to talk really fast. One of the other areas that Troward writes about is the process of growth. Growth fascinates me. Growth fascinates me. I love to watch growing things, whether it's the tomatoes in my garden or whether it is myself growing through and understanding things maybe a little bit better than I used to, or at least being a little less confused than I used to. Hearing growth from some of you when you tell me about where you were maybe when you first found new thought and where you are as you've been practicing. I'm energized by the concept of growth. Troward said this, "My mind is a center of divine operation. The divine operation is always for expansion and fuller expression. And this means the production of something beyond what has gone before, something entirely new, not included in past experiences, though proceeding out of it by an orderly sequence of growth. Therefore, since the divine cannot change its inherent nature, it must operate in the same manner with me. Consequently, in my own special world of which I am the center, it will move forward to produce new conditions, always in advance of any that have gone before." Some of you may be familiar with the philosopher and Eastern thought writer Ken Wilber. He was one, I believe, who popularized the phrase transcend and include. And it's this concept that as we grow and evolve, and there's evidence of this even in biology, there's also evidence of it in consciousness exploration, that as we grow and evolve, it's not that we lose what came before. It's not that we lose access to those maybe less developed levels of consciousness, but that what happens is we move beyond them, we transcend them, but we still include them. They're still a part of us. Some of you may recall a couple of years ago, I think I did a series on nature and shared with you some learnings and teachings from different characters or animals or creatures in nature. Chambered nautilus is one such creature that as it grows, that beautiful spiral is the result of the chambered nautilus growing and needing a bigger space to live in. And so it creates a bigger shell in ever widening spirals, right? And yet it is still connected to the very earliest of those chambers. It's a beautiful visual, I think, of what it is for you and for me to grow and evolve spiritually, metaphysically, emotionally. My mind is a center of divine operation. The divine operation is always for expansion and fuller expression. That's true of you, that's true of me, and it has nothing to do with our age. There is that in us that is always pushing forward, if you will, to grow us, to evolve us. Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was considered to be called a futurist by Buckminster Fuller, was also a friend of mine and a prayer partner of mine for a lot of years before she passed. And she used to talk about the exciting times we're living in, that all of the really tough things that are happening in the world today, whether it's in politics or in government or in the planet, that these are powerful evolutionary drivers that are pushing in on us as a species to help us try to find a higher and better way of being together. I think she's right with that. And I think that's also true for us individually. Sometimes it takes something from the outside in our lives that pushes us in such a way. It could be a financial problem, it could be a relationship problem, it could be a health problem, that pushes us to a place where suddenly we need to live differently, where suddenly we realize, oh my gosh, I've got to make some changes. Where maybe in the past we'd been, yeah, I really should do this differently, or I really should do that. But we don't until what? Am I the only one that's ever operated this way? Am I? You're just eavesdropping on a conversation I'm having in my head with me. I'm having a heck of a good time. Anyway, these things, sometimes we're reluctant to do our own growing, even when we have an inkling that there's some way that we should grow. And so sometimes I think it's as if this benevolent universe conspires to bring into our life that difficult person or that unplanned event for us to wake up and make a different choice out of that divine center of operation that we are. Let me see if there's only one or two more thoughts. One more thought I'll share with you. I had so many more. I'm going to share two really fast. I promise to do really fast. His thoughts on success, he says, it is the direction and not the magnitude which is to be taken into consideration. It's the direction and not the magnitude that's to be taken into consideration. So sometimes when we're trying to accomplish something, we want so much to get there super, super fast. What this is saying to us is what matters more is making sure that we're going in the right direction to begin with. Any of you who were lovers of Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he talks about the ladder to success. He says, make sure it's leaning against the right wall. Because if it's not, you'll only get to the wrong place faster. That's what Troward is saying here as well. It's the direction and not the magnitude which is to be taken into consideration. Was it Confucius or Lao Tzu who said, the way to Mount Olympus is just every step. Just take the step right in front of you, right? Going in the right direction. And the last, I wish our health field would embrace this thought totally. The law of flotation was not discovered by contemplating the sinking of things, but by contemplating the floating of things, which floated naturally, and then intelligently asking why they did so. I'm going to repeat that. The law of flotation was not discovered by contemplating the sinking of things, but by contemplating the floating of things which floated naturally, and then intelligently asking why they did so. Maybe we would learn even more if we studied healthy people. And I know there's more of a movement toward that. Healthy people, why are they healthy? There's this whole phenomenon called the blue zones of areas in the world where there's a high percentage of people living to be 100 and more. What if we studied healthy marriages or healthy relationships to unpack why they work rather than studying what's decaying and falling apart? It's worth consideration. So his two premises, the reciprocal action of the universe, and that mental action influences material conditions. Namaste.